When someone gets really ill, do they go to the hospital over on the base? Because they've got a pretty modern clinic over there.
They don't treat them with medicine. They just go there for taking the blood and then X-ray.
So what happens when somebody is seriously ill?
They cannot do anything.
The most consistent example given is the example of the Ronald Reagan missile site and Ibai next to it. On the Ronald Reagan missile site, there's a vivid example of the United States, golf courses and swimming pools and all kinds of amenities. Right next to it is what is called the slum of the Pacific.
It's a challenge. Ibai is in great need right now. We've talked about infrastructure. One of the projects the U.S. is working with our Australian colleagues and with the Asia Development Bank is a sewer and water project, desperately needed for Ibai. Ibai is overcrowded. The schools need repair.
Actually, the U.S. military did a survey back in the 70s and found that the sewers didn't work and the water didn't run and the electricity wasn't there. It only happened not all that long ago. They found almost exactly the same thing. Why hasn't that been fixed?
There's complete agreement that Ibai should be a priority, and not only because of the current activities of the Ronald Reagan Space and Missile Defense Site, but there's also now an additional component that is providing for global security, and that's the Space Fence project by the Air Force.
Every missile fired on the Marshall Islands by the U.S. military costs $100 million each. This derelict school bus is the only one on Ibai. They can't afford to replace it.
The base is not good for us. The people of Marshall Islands, we have no need for it.
It's being used to test missiles to fire at countries like China.
Yes, and anywhere else if they want to.
What would you like to see happen there?
I want our land back.
This is Shanghai, the historic port on the Yangtze River, China's greatest city. I had arranged to meet the American author James Bradley, whose latest best-selling book, The China Mirage, reveals an extraordinary hidden history of American power and modern China.
It was almost illegal for someone like me to know a Chinese for almost all of American history. The Chinese came to America to mine gold and build the railroads, and Americans decided we didn't like the competition. So in 1882, we had the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which kept the Chinese out of the United States for about 100 years. So you have the largest population in the world that can't come to the United States. So at just the point we're putting up the Statue of Liberty saying we welcome everybody, we were erecting a wall saying we welcome everybody except those Chinese.
Fear of a rising China today is the latest chapter in a history of propaganda that presented the Chinese as uncouth and infantile. To Western popular and political culture, the Chinese became the yellow peril, and racial stereotypes bore the constant theme of fear and threat.
Boris Karloff as the evil Fu Manchu, his passion for power twisting his brilliant mind as he revels in the horrors of human sacrifice and torture. Behind the mask of Fu Manchu.
This caricature of an entire people concealed another agenda: opium. For the American elite in the 19th century, China was a gold mine of drugs.
Warren Delano, the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the American opium king of China. He was the biggest American opium dealer, second to the British. He welcomed the first American ship into China to help out with the opium wars. Much of the east coast of America, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, were born from opium money. The American Industrial Revolution was funded by huge pools of money. Where did this come from? It came from illegal drugs in the biggest market in the world, China.
Let me get this right. The grandfather of arguably the most liberal president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a drug runner.
Yes, sir. Franklin Delano Roosevelt never made much money in his life. He had public service jobs that were very lowly paid, but he had yachts, he had summer homes, he had mansions in New York City. The kids went to private schools. He inherited a fortune from Warren Delano, his father, who was the American opium king of China. If you scratch anyone with the name Forbes in their name, John Forbes Carey, Secretary of State John Forbes Carey.
That's the present Secretary of State.
Yes, sir. You'll find opium money. His great-grandfather was an opium dealer. How big was opium money? Opium money built the first industrial city in the United States, Lowell, Massachusetts. It built the first 5 railroads in the United States. Opium money all over the East Coast, but it wasn't talked about. It was called the China trade. And if you go to various museums, you can see teas and silks exhibited, and they keep quiet about all that big opium money.
In the scramble to get opium money, China was invaded and colonized by Britain and the other imperial powers. Foreign armies grabbed whole swathes of China. This is the American army in Tiananmen Square, Peking, in 1900. Great cities like Shanghai were taken over and declared concessions, and foreigners lived a life of privilege and luxury amidst terrible poverty imposed on the Chinese. A resistance, known as the Boxer Rebellion, was put down with a savagery. This rape of China set the tone for how China was perceived in the West well into the 20th century. This is the distinguished historian Theodore H. White, an advisor to the White House, speaking in the 1960s.
Perhaps China is too vast to be governed by mercy. Yet if Chinese mind craves order, they must be brought to recognize they are the biggest factor in the world's disorder. And we must untangle the madness of their mind. The most difficult task in the world is to reach the minds of men who hate you.
What White was really complaining about was the loss of a China that the Imperial West could dominate, and the defeat of General Chiang Kai-shek, who with his famously powerful Christian wife, Mei Ling-sung, guarded America's interests in China. That is, until they were thrown out in 1949 by a communist revolution led by Mao Zedong.
Mao had beaten Chiang Kai-shek 3 times in huge battles involving millions of combatants. Mao was a winner in this contest from the early 1930s on, but we knew very little about it, and people don't understand that even today.
Shanghai hears the message clearly as foreign businessmen board up their shops. Go now, go quickly, for communism marches. Take what you can, but flee. In pell-mell haste, the Western powers evacuate the city they have built, for good and bad alike must leave. The businessmen come for profit, as well as missionaries come to heal, must say goodbye, as out the Yangtze steams the last of Western influence, and farewell to a century.
Even today, it's difficult to understand the paranoia ignited by Mao's revolution.
As we look at China on the map, we can see that China is the basic cause of all of our troubles in Asia.
I believe that for the sake of our safety, it is necessary to be prepared for the possibility of a Chinese missile attack on the United States.
One of the myths about Mao is that he was an implacable enemy of the capitalist West. Shanghai today is a prosperous international city, still run by the communists, at least in name. When I was last in China more than a generation ago, the loudest noise was the tinkling of bicycle bells. Mao had just died, the streets were dark, the universities were closed. The chaos of the Cultural Revolution had given way to a great silence. "We're exhausted," was the freest comment I heard. Coming back, the change is barely comprehensible. Here in Shanghai, the freedom bears no comparison. Yes, there are issues with human rights, especially the right to speak against the state and challenge its power. Since I was last here, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, many of them into an entirely new middle class. This epic is still barely understood in the West, or should that be willfully misunderstood? The truth is that China has matched America at its own great game of capitalism, and that is unforgivable. One measure of China's new capitalism is the Uran Rich List. This league table of China's mega-rich is published by Rupert Hugenworth, an old Etonian whose Chinese name is Huran. He's received many awards, including China's Man of the Year.
This year, 2015, has probably been the most extraordinary year of wealth creation in the history of China again. You know, I've been doing this list for 15, 16 years. I've never seen a year like 2015. You know, normally for £200 million or $300 million, we find, say, about 800,000 people. This year, 2015, it's doubled. There'll be more dollar billionaires known about in China than in the US. So the US, up until now, has been the leader in terms of business, the most successful business tycoons in the world. China 2015 will have overtaken the US, so amazing.
Modern China is full of telling ironies, not least this museum that was once the house where Mao and his comrades secretly founded the Communist Party of China in 1921. Today it stands in the heart of an exclusive, very capitalist shopping district. When you leave the shrine to China's Great Revolution, you're confronted by a surreal spectacle. For right outside where the Chinese Communist Party was born are the very symbols of capitalism. Starbucks, Apple, Cartier, Dolce & Gabbana, and down there perhaps the free market's greatest triumph, bottled water that ensures you live young, costing £6 for a small bottle in my hotel. Would Mao spin in his tomb if he was here? I'm not so sure. Hidden history is always a key to the truth. 5 years before his great communist revolution in 1949, Mao sent this secret message to Washington. China must industrialize, wrote Mao. This can only be done by free enterprise. Chinese and American interests fit together economically and politically. America need not fear that we will not be cooperative. We cannot risk crossing America. We cannot risk any conflict. Mao received no reply. Nothing has changed.
Mao Zedong was looking to be a friend with the United States from the beginning. Mao says, I will go meet Franklin Roosevelt in the White House. Mao reaches out in 1950 to Harry Truman. He reaches out to Dwight Eisenhower. His hand was tossed away.
This opportunity that might have changed history, prevented wars, saved countless lives, was lost because the truth of Mao's overtures was denied in the Washington of the 1950s. State Department officials who had carried Mao's messages were condemned unjustly as communist traitors.
Everybody who knew Mao, who spoke Chinese, was gone. In the 1950s, the State Department had no employees who spoke Chinese. It's resulted in us not having relations with the #1 most populous country in the world.
In 1979, this man, Deng Xiaoping, became China's paramount leader. He said, socialism does not mean shared poverty. This was code for the most radical reform since Mao's revolution, the return of capitalism to China, but this time controlled by the Communist Party. To be rich is glorious, Deng was reported as saying. America was now threatened by the emergence of a vast image of itself. This is one of the many very exclusive gated communities in Shanghai, where an apartment is one of the prizes of the new communism. I had arranged to see Professor Zhang Weiwei, a close aide to the late Deng Xiaoping, the man who changed China.
Deng is really extremely long-term visionary, a leader with exceedingly long-term and strategic vision for his country, for his people. And China is still following that path. Yeah. Actually, this is really a tradition from China's long history. You look at even like Mao, he said we should, surpass UK by which year, we should surpass United States by which year. So this tradition continues to this day. Even Xi Jinping today is also doing the same. Actually, what many Chinese have problem with Western media is the stereotypes about China. If you are content with stereotypes, you miss so many things. If BBC broadcasts something, they are happy to always mention this communist dictatorship, this autocracy. No, actually, with this kind of label, you cannot understand this China as it is. But if you watch BBC or CNN or read Economist and try to understand China, it will be a failure. It's impossible.
Multiple parties fight for political power and everyone voting on them as the only path to salvation to the long-suffering developing
This is Eric Lee, a Shanghai entrepreneur, educated in America, and typical of a new, confident, outspoken political class.
Now in China, there are a lot of problems, but at the moment, the Chinese, the party state, has proven an extraordinary ability to change. I mean, I make the joke how in America, you can change political parties, but you can't change the policies. In China, you cannot change the party, but you can change policies. So in the 65 or 66 years, China is being run by one single party, yet the political changes that have taken place in China in this past 66 years have been wider and broader and greater than probably any other major country in modern memory.
So in that time, China ceased to be communist. Is that what you're saying?
Well, China is a market economy, and it's a vibrant market economy, but it is not a capitalist country. Here's why. There's no way a group of billionaires could control the Politburo as billionaires control American policymaking. So in China, you have a vibrant market economy, but capital does not rise above political authority. Capital does not have enshrined rights. In America, capital, the interest of capital and capital itself has risen above the American nation. The political authority cannot check the power of capital. And that's why America is a capitalist country, but China is not.
This is the ironic title of a best-selling book by Zhang Lizhe, a journalist and critic who lives in Beijing.
Many Americans imagine that the Chinese people live a miserable, repressed life with no freedom whatsoever. That's not quite true. If you speak to many ordinary Chinese people, they will tell you they feel their life are quite free. Some 500 million people being lifted out of poverty, and some would say probably 600 million people. That's a great achievement. For many Americans, the yellow peril has never left them. I think there's a fear about China. Of course, there's a fear of China's rapid rise, but it also has a lot to do with China's the label as a communist state.
China's objectives are modest compared with their weight. They're not trying to run the world. They're not even trying to run Asia Pacific. I think they want to keep America from dominating the Asia Pacific. So they have what they believe is their rightful place in Asia Pacific because of long civilization, long history, and their size. So their objectives are really modest compared with their capacity.
The wealth, the new wealth in China, they often say this is the product of self-made entrepreneurial skill.
Yeah.
But is it not also the product of the exploitation of people at the bottom? What are known in China as migrants, but they're not really migrants, they're Chinese.
If you really, go to talk to these migrant workers, you will find quite surprisingly, over the past 5 to 7 years, they have experienced a greater income increase than any other social groups. China is not a class society.
But China is a class society. These are the homes of migrant workers, people who build and service the new China. Here it's not uncommon for 3 families to share one tiny flat.
You would associate a socialist country with equality, but unfortunately, since the reform has started, China has become one of the most unequal societies in the world. The income gap is widening. Government, I feel, have retreated some of the responsibilities, left the market to take over, but the market does not always treat women kindly. Some private companies, they would just refuse to hire childbearing age women. And sometimes when women become pregnant, they will sack them. because they don't want to pay the maternity leave. And in fact, the income gap has grown much bigger between men and women.
Your old boss, Deng Xiaoping, presided over the bloodshed in Tiananmen Square. What would you say to the survivors of Tiananmen Square? Because so many of those did fight for what they saw as democratic change in China.
In 1989, there were two political forces. One was those represented by the Chinese students. Their hero was Mikhail Gorbachev, who happened to be in Beijing. Their slogan was, Soviet Union's today, China's tomorrow. So the idea was political reform first, other reform second. Otherwise, China would be hopeless. And Deng's message was the opposite. He thought Gorbachev was an idiot. He thought, China must have economic reform first, other reform second. This priority must be set clearly. Unfortunately, at that particular moment in 1989, the two political forces could not reach a compromise. So definitely a tragedy occurred.
It was more than a tragedy. It was a massacre, of which the memory remains a raw presence in modern China.
Why does the Chinese state still fear the few who speak out? And I'm thinking of
Liu Xiaobo.
Exactly. I mean, this man won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's in prison.
He's violating Chinese law, by a big margin. So actually the freedom of expression, similar views are aired by many people, but he's really going to the extreme.
Liu Xiaobo challenged the government to implement democratic reforms and has spent a total of 13 years in prison.
Why can't a confident China accept a criticism like this?
So Nobel Peace Committee makes huge mistake. They owe the Chinese an explanation. If you cross the line, you violate the constitution, you violate so many laws, you should be punished.
And yet in China today, the spirit of protest and dissent lives on in different forms. In 2015, strikes and community protests and activism reached record levels. This resistance is seldom reported in the West.
So there are lots of protests in China. Typically, for example, land being grabbed by officials for commercial development, and the farmers are not being compensated properly. But the farmers now know more aware of their rights, so they protest. Or young workers from the factory, they demand a better wage or better working condition. But many of the protests, they are economic driven, not political driven. They are regional, not nationwide. So this kind of things will unlikely develop into real movement, or so-called, you call that revolution.
So the Mao's revolution was the last revolution?
Well, never say never.
The Japanese island of Okinawa is occupied by 32 military installations. From here, the United States has attacked Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, Iraq. The sky is full of planes and helicopters. Wherever people go, they are fenced in and told to keep out. Okinawa is the front line of a beckoning war with China. Aged 87, Fumiko Shimabukuro is one of the leaders of a non-violent resistance that's challenging Washington's pivot to Asia.
카메라 휘겨워서 없었어요. 어떡하나 갔다. こういうような惨めな戦争をね、二度とやってはいけないと。で、そのためには私はその生きて何をすべきか、基地を一つでもね、なくすのが私の仕事で。
Fumiko is a survivor. A quarter of the civilians on the island were killed in the American invasion in 1945, and a fear of war has been passed through the generations. Today, those who witness these horrors live in a place of extraordinary beauty, surrounded by coral reefs and a unique marine life. It was here in Hanoko Bay that the survivors of World War II sought refuge, and it's this they're now fighting to save. It's an epic struggle that pits these island people against the greatest military power on Earth. This is the office of a former governor of Okinawa, Oto Masahide. What he has done is create not so much a museum, but an appeal to the outside world to understand the resistance in Okinawa, to understand the suffering, to read its hidden history. It begins in 1945 when the Americans invaded. Here is General MacArthur arriving in Okinawa. A second invasion happened 10 years later in what became known as the Bulldozers and Bayonets campaign. American forces seized prime agricultural land, burned farmhouses, and killed livestock. The dispossessed people of Okinawa marched the length of Japan, appealing for help. This wall is devoted to a resistance in Okinawa that never ceases. Everywhere people go on the island, they are confronted by this sign. It tells them they must not go past this fence topped with barbed wire. These fences run like great ribbons across the island, and the bases themselves cut swathes across Okinawa. But all around them are people with this continuing demonstration, this continuing resistance. And they have a message. It's people of the world. Watch what Japan and the US are doing. Don't let them force the bases on Okinawa.
そしてね、沖縄はずっと戦後ずっと基地はもうこれ以上の基地は負担は嫌だと言ってきたことを日本政府はアメリカに対してはっきりものを言っていない。アメリカにもいい顔、沖縄にもいい顔してる。だからそれに対して腹が立ってちゃんとアメリカにものを言ってくれという気持ちでいます。だからここにジュゴンの保護区を作るためにはここに基地があったらできません。だからその基地はですね、国がもたらされてくるという民話があります。でその民話の中にジュゴンがですね、担い家内の幸からその幸を担い家内からその死者をですねがやってくるというふうに言われています。その担い家内から死者を連れてくる時にですね、ジュゴンの背中に乗ってくるというふうに 言われているんですね。
All this will be lost when much of the bay becomes concrete runways for bombers at Camp Schwab, the huge US Marine base behind this fence. In 2014, Okinawa elected a new governor, Takeshi Onaga, who won by a landslide on one issue, stopping the new base at Hanoka. This was election night outside the American base at Camp Schwab.
ああ、足止めです。こんばんは。はい。
ありがとう。ありがとう。ありがとう。やったー。やった
勝利。なんとも言えない涙が出てきました。自分たちが頑張った分、でもね、これからその基地がなくなるまで私は頑張りたいと思ってます。本当に今日は生きていてよかったと思います。はい。We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
The New Year's celebration